So I'm going to go ahead and get started since we're recording this and we only have a little bit of time together today. Um, Welcome to how to turn your social change vision into an actual nonprofit organization. I'm really happy to be here doing these trainings. I love doing these trainings. Um, I'm going to move through everything today, and please feel free, and I'll say this again. Over time, over the course of the training, please feel free to pop questions into the chat and the question box as we go along. Um, so I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Brooke Richie-Babbage, for those of you who don't know me. I have been in the nonprofit sector my entire professional life. Nonprofits are in my blood, they are my happy place. I started off interning at the New York office of the ACLU my freshman summer in college and was bitten by the bug of social change. We were stuffed into this tiny little office around the corner from Bryant Park right as it was becoming nice. This was back when it was still a little bit of a cesspool. In the early 90s. And I followed the executive director around to meetings and I sat in on budget and strategy meetings and I was hooked. I co-founded my first organization during my time at Harvard Law in the Kennedy School. And I was looking for a way to connect Boston school children to legal support through the law school and to do legislative advocacy through the Kennedy School. And so that was my first experience. I co-founded that actually also with a good friend named Brooke. Um, I moved to New York after I graduated from law and policy school to practice public interest law at a nonprofit that at the time was called the Welfare Law Center and is now the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. And I was working to protect the rights of teen parents to stay in high school and college. And that actually then became the foundation for the second organization that I founded in 2007, training cohorts of teenagers to identify social justice issues that they're passionate about and to design, launch, and lead social impact initiatives in their own communities. Right about that time, I joined my first two boards. And I learned about boards through trial by fire. I jumped in as early in my career as I could, and I was super hands-on. I still, to this day, am a huge fan of highly engaged board membership. And my first two boards, one was a 20-year-old organizing group in East Harlem, and the other was a startup nonprofit supporting first-time homeowners. So I've always used board membership and engagement as a way to keep my fingers in social impact and social advocacy worlds that I care very deeply about. I became a professor of social entrepreneurship and nonprofit leadership in early 2010s, 2013, at the Brooke Graduate School of Public Affairs, and became a full-time consultant and executive coach a few years later when I stepped down as CEO of my organization. I launched my Accelerator and Launch Lab programs earlier this year, which I'll mention briefly at the end. And I became involved in the Social Justice Accelerator in partnership with the Urban Justice Center 2 years ago, which I'll also tell you about at the end. So I say all of this to say that my journey has been long, and the through line has been my deep commitment to supporting mission-driven work and to helping build the capacity of leaders of mission-driven institutions and organizations. One thing I want to lift up about my story is that I know what it feels like to start and grow a nonprofit. I've been there. I get it. I know how amazing it can feel to look around at something that's growing and taking shape. And I know how hard it sometimes is to know what to do next. And so that's what I'm hoping to bring to bear today. My 20 plus years of experience and my deep in my bones knowledge of the questions and challenges that are inherent in the startup and launch process. I've got a great training, really packed today. I'm going to walk through what it looks like to start your organization in a way that sets it up to grow and to last quickly and without the overwhelm that so often comes with launching an organization. We'll start with a brief overview of the why We're here. This is really critical. There's a reason that you showed up today and that you are even thinking about translating your idea into an institution. So we should always start there. That should be your North Star. Then for the path, we'll talk about the three core elements of a high impact organization. And I'll introduce the three-part framework that I've honed over my 20 years and used with hundreds of organizations and students around the country, specifically to launch and scale high impact organizations. And then we'll talk about the building blocks, and I'll break down how to use the building blocks of organizational design to apply the framework in your own work. And finally, I'll talk about some ways to get you started executing on what we talk about today right away. So let's get started. You are in the right place. You are absolutely going to walk away today with some more information and frameworks to help organize your thinking. So I wanted to start there. The other thing I'll say is I love quotes. They're going to keep showing up in this training. They're sort of like the universal language. Everybody gets quotes, really good quotes. So this quote is one of my favorites. Each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own, populated with their own ambitions, friends, routines, worries, and inherited craziness. An epic story that continues invisibly around you like an anthill sprawling deep underground, with elaborate passageways to thousands of other lives that you'll never know existed. So I love this quote for so many reasons, but as it pertains to this topic, because everyone watching this training is coming from a different place and with a different constellation of questions, concerns, and challenges. A friend once used the metaphor of a movie when describing how it can feel sometimes to walk through the world. We're all in our own separate, distinct, and fully fleshed out movies. And each of our movies has its own plot, its story arc, and villains and heroes. Soundtracks, some of us are really into soundtracks like I am. In my movie, there's a story arc about a foundation that backed out of a gift right after I'd made all the plans about how to allocate the funding. In your movie, you could be battling board members that say they're going to do things and then don't. The point is that we all feel like our movies are very real to us, and they are. And at the same time, it's important to remember that while no two nonprofits and no two experiences of launch and leadership inhabit exactly the same movie, it's also true that our individual stories share some common and profoundly similar underlying plots. Every person starting or running an organization is a steward of a journey of transformation. And that journey looks different for different people on the surface. But at its core, what you're doing is about creating change in the world. And so, in really important ways, we're all undergoing the same journey. We're all together like a big, great web. And so I wanted to start there so that we remember as we go through today's training that so many of the questions and challenges we have that as we think about turning our vision into a reality, feel crazy and chaotic, but they are really common. And that means that they are surmountable. So let's start with some of the common plot lines. This may be you. You have started an organization because you saw a need. For many of you, you may be a doctor, teacher. I was a lawyer, a social worker. I work, interestingly, with a lot of artists, dancers, conservationists. You may be someone who has a profession or has a deep expertise, and you are starting or thinking about starting a nonprofit because you see a need, you see a problem, but you've never fundraised before. You don't know the first thing about an effective fundraising campaign or donor segments. You've never been trained in any of this. You've heard about boards, maybe even sat on a board, but you don't actually know what they do in practice or how to form one, or what your first meeting should look like or your 15th meeting should look like. There are things that are operational and not about the mission of an organization, and maybe those feel sort of foreign and tough. This could be you. You have this amazing idea and you have friends and advisors supporting you, but you don't actually know how to move beyond the idea. In this stage, there's always more work than people, meaning everyone's doing everything and it's hands-on. You have a working board, you have friends that are helping you. You know that this idea is really powerful. You've tested it, you've talked to people, but making it concrete can feel overwhelming, right? Who do you hire? You're nervous about hiring actual staff because you don't actually know what the right staffing model is for your idea. You know you need to find new people for your board, but you don't know where to find them. You don't know how to make your idea concrete. These are really common. Many people in this phase feel like they are floating into this deep end pool of operations and the IRS and legal incorporation documents and EIN numbers and workers' comp. I get a lot of questions about workers' comp and insurance. And you're looking around at all the infrastructure stuff and you're like, this is not what I signed up for. And even if you love institution building and are not weirded out by all the operations, you might feel like there's a lot of it and you're anxious about trying to do everything and feeling like you're going to let balls drop. No matter what your particular starting point is or your sort of movie plot, this startup phase is this messy space between the generative big picture vision and a solid, stable organization. It's called the startup phase. And I remember those years when I was in my own startup phase with both of my organizations. No matter what, no matter how messy it feels, um, no matter how many unanswered questions you feel like you have, and this vague notion that you're living in one giant blind spot, um, the readiness, the instinct, the intention is to stabilize, is to grow, is to feel like you know the rules of the game so that you can make smart and strategic decisions, so that you can feel confident in your next step and the next step beyond that, is to get to the point where you know the steps to take to bring in the money, to get the team, to get the board. You want clarity. There's so many things to do. You want to know what's urgent, what isn't, and what to do in what order. That's the thing that's similar for all of us. The other thing that's really similar at the core of everyone's messiness is that you have a mission. You have this idea or this vision that you believe in enough to get up every day and come to trainings like this and to really fight for it. You recognize the urgency of reaching more lives, more communities. I work with people all the time who are talking about, they're doing great work and they want to leave a legacy, or they want to grow because there's so many more kids in their communities that they know would benefit from their work, but they just need more funding or they just need more staff, that point to the deep fissures in our society and feel the urgency of trying to mend and heal them. But to do that, they have to grow their institutions. There is this urgency around impact. And so that is something that is common for all of us. That's the why, this impact. And this training is about a roadmap to growing your organization to the point where you can carry out the vision for change that you have in the world. So that's what we're going to do today. And I'd love to get started with the three-part framework for launching and growing a high impact nonprofit. I'm going to walk through each part of the framework one piece at a time. So the first is clarity. And here's the quote for this part. If you focus the rays of the sun through a lens, they can burn cotton or a piece of paper, but the scattered rays of the sun cannot do that, right? And so I love this quote because it highlights the core power of strategic clarity. Just like sunlight, when dispersed, it's pleasant, it's warm, like our mission statement. Even a really focused mission statement is strategically dispersed. It's broad. It doesn't say what to say yes to, what to say no to. But when you aim your sunlight, when you aim your attention at a single point, it becomes laser sharp. When you concentrate your resources in the same way and aim them at a tight, clear, and coherent end goal, a strategic goal, the result is far more powerful than when your energy is dispersed. Ultimately, the clearer your vision of the specific impact you want to have as early as possible in your process, the easier it will be to raise money and to build a team, which are two of the very first things you're going to want to do. So there are a few myths and truths that I want to break down. First, you may hear strategic plan, strategic clarity, these words a lot, particularly in the startup and early phases. So I want to be really clear about what I mean when I say strategic clarity and the role that it plays in helping you launch your organization and grow it from the beginning. What I don't mean is just your mission statement. Like I said, it's too broad and it doesn't include strategic choices. Even a really tight mission statement, which you definitely want to have, doesn't help you laser focus on what to say yes and no to, which is the heart and the power of strategy. It's also not your programs and what you're doing, right? That's not strategic clarity. Those are your activities. They are how you implement your strategic choices, but they are not in and of themselves strategic choices. And finally, it's not the vision that you've articulated to potential donors, to board members, and some of you, depending on where you are in your process, may be really good at articulating a really clear vision in funding proposals. But even a really clear strategic vision isn't what I mean by strategic clarity, the kind that you need in startup mode. I mean three specific things. First, in addition to a clear mission, you must have a compelling and clear theory of change. Everything grows out of your theory of change. This is a 2 to 3 sentence statement that draws an explicit bridge between the problem you've identified and you're trying to solve, for who, and the actions you're going to take to solve the problem. It's your theory of how to create the change that you care about. And in your theory of change, you need to answer 4 questions very concisely. What's the problem you're trying to solve? Why is it a problem? Not why does it fascinate you, but why is it actually a problem for society or for the donor or funder that you're talking to? What are you doing to solve the problem? Concisely, what are the actions you are taking? These aren't your programs. These are the strategies that you're using to solve the problem. And how will what you're doing address the problem? Why these strategies? The key here is to make sure that you have a deep understanding of the problem you're solving, what causes it, why it's a problem, and how exactly what you're doing will make the problem better. The second thing you need is a clear set of strategic priorities and goals for the next year. Now, in an ideal world, you have a 3-year set of strategic priorities and goals, but you at least need to. Some of you won't be there, right? You're still in your idea phase. You want to have at least the next year mapped out. I love this quote. I didn't write this one down, but you may have heard it. We're lost, but at least we're making great progress. So, or making great time. The we're lost, but we're making great time approach to nonprofit launch and growth and impact doesn't work. Your strategic priorities and goals are how you define yourself and how you define the scope of what you're trying to accomplish for anyone working with you or that you're trying to get to fund you. It sets your goals within a specific time horizon, and it allows you to say to potential supporters and donors, this is what success looks like within that time horizon. These priorities are at the core of the power of strategic thinking, which, as I've mentioned, is about making choices, saying no to things. So your strategic priorities for the next year or 3 years, if you're at that point in your growth, should be about what kind of money you want to ask for, what kind of staff you want to hire, and in what order, when to say yes to new program opportunities, and when to say no to. That's what your strategic priorities will help you do. Now, I am not talking about a massive 20-page strategic plan document. In the startup phase, the kind of strategic plan that you should be aiming to create is no more than 2 pages. And I'll give my email at the end. I have a toolkit and a model of a 2-page strategic plan that is really all you need. Anything longer, and you're going to see the efficacy and the sort of effectiveness of the plan decrease incredibly. You need to answer just a few questions in this initial strategic plan document. What kind of impact do you want to have in the next year or 3 years? What are the changes in knowledge, behavior, or status are you trying to create? That's how we measure changes in outcomes. What are your strengths and weaknesses now? What can you leverage as a strength, and what do you need to make sure you mitigate or avoid as a weakness? What are your organizational priorities? Are you thinking primarily about establishing strategic partnerships, or are you thinking primarily about litigation, right? Or thought leadership, which, depending on your mission, may be something you want to come out of the gate with. And then finally, what programs and activities are best suited to meet those priorities? So the third piece of strategic clarity in the startup phase is a clear program logic model and early evaluation plan. You have to be able to describe concisely the internal logic of your programming, what you're doing, and how it actually links to clear outcomes. And then your evaluation plan can be very simple, but you've got to test those assumptions, right? Test that logic. The earlier you start doing that, the more data you will have for bringing in donors, bring in supporters down the line. So that's what strategic clarity looks like in the startup phase. As I've said, if you aren't laser clear about your planned impact, about your theory of change, about how to get there, about your plan for how to get there, then you won't be able to convince people to give you their money or their time. And those are the things you need: fundraising and staff, or capacity, which we're going to talk about, staff and board in the early years. So clarity is really at the core of all of this. I love this metaphor of building a house. Strategic clarity is like the blueprint. You can spend a lot of time building walls, right? You build one wall, you go and you build another wall. Maybe you have some volunteers, maybe you have early staff, and they're helping you build these walls. You're setting up programs, you're raising money, you're doing great work. But then you take a step back and you discover that the walls don't perfectly line up with one another, right? You're doing a lot of work, but you're not necessarily doing it in a way that builds towards something that has impact. And so having the blueprint, the strategic clarity up front is really critical. The second element of the framework is capital. And what I mean by capital is both fundraising and finances. And so this quote is speaks to the fact that this is perhaps the area where people get the most tripped up. And this doesn't actually change based on how old an organization is, but I find it to be particularly acute in the startup phase. People look around at what everyone else is doing and get stressed that, they don't have a $10,000 major donor, or their event didn't make $80,000. They're looking at tactics rather than focusing on strategy. And so this quote is about the importance of thinking about your fundraising as a model, not just a constellation of tactics, from the very beginning, as early as possible. So again, some myths and some truths, what it isn't. Really paying attention to your capital is not cobbling together a lot of events and campaigns to bring in as much money as you can. It's not just that, right? It's really important in early years to focus on revenue, to focus on income. But the sooner you can level that up and organize or orient the lots of different things you're doing into a larger system or larger model, the more effective your fundraising will be early on. One of the organizations that I work with in my Accelerator program went from $300,000 to $950,000 in budget, sustained, right? Consistent income in under a year, in part because early in the year, she took a step back and reorganized, restructured her fundraising tactics into a model, into a system. She got rid of certain things, she leaned into other things. She was really strategic about it. So it's not just the cobbling together. It's not just applying for dozens of tiny little program grants. In my early years of starting my organization, I was so excited when I get a $10,000 grant. And in the early years, that can be great for paying for program materials and things like that. But very quickly, you are going to want to think about how to invest in systems that let you get larger sums of money. So capital isn't going to, you're not going to increase your capital with $1 and $5 and even $10,000 grants. It's not trying to get a bunch of rich people on your board. A startup board is different than a large scale fundraising board. And so while it is important that boards give, you're not going to sustain yourself in terms of healthy capital infrastructure just by having a lot of wealthy people on your board. That's only one piece. Your board is only one piece of the model. Finally, capital is not just about fundraising. It's also about being smart about how you define the financial health of your organization from the beginning. So I'll talk a little bit more about what it actually is, what I mean by fundraising and finance. So first, and this is the finance piece, this is the crux of financial health in the startup phase, is going to be a true cost budget. You must have a clear and accurate budget that tells the story of what it will cost to achieve your vision. So if you think back to the clarity section where I said you have to have that clear set of priorities and goals for the first year or for the next year, your true cost budget assigns numbers to that, right? This is what we want to accomplish, this is the impact we want to have. And I'm really precise about it. And this is what it costs. And I call it a true cost budget because you have to train yourself to fundraise for what it actually costs to run your organization. And that means what it costs to pay for staff, what it costs to pay for programs. If you have to rent space, what overhead costs, if you have insurance. We did advocacy in my organization. And so we had to have particular kinds of directors and officers insurance. It means paying yourself a salary if you're the executive director. Now you can donate that salary back, but you have to have a line in the budget for your salary, or else you are not capturing the true cost of what it means to achieve, of what it looks like to achieve your vision. So in the startup phase, the core, the foundation of your financial health, what will become the pillars of your financial health as you grow, starts with a true cost accurate budget. The second is knowing who your true donors and funders are, getting to be really familiar with your donor and funder avatars or archetypes. You need to know who your people are. And what I mean by that is the ones who, when they hear your mission, they raise their hands and they say, yes, tell me more. You do not want to waste your very limited time and energy broadcasting your message and trying to convince people who have very little affinity for it, right? Who are not the ones who are going to hear it and think, oh my God, that resonates with me. Spending time trying to convince or cajole other people is a waste of time. And it can be really scary to notch down and to focus on who your people are, but that's where you're going to get way, way earlier the highest return on investment on your fundraising. As an example, I am not someone who will probably donate to most animal related causes. Do I care about animals? Yes. I absolutely texted to give to the ASPCA when those Sarah McLachlan songs used to come on about the angels. Totally, I'm not a monster. I love an adorable puppy. But my thing has always been children in poverty. That's what gets me, right? It's going to take a lot more emails and phone calls and efforts to get me to give and to get me to give more and to really invest because that's not my thing. Now, my son is all about animals. He already donates his allowance to the ASPCA. Anytime something about animals comes on the television or he sees advertisements, like his ears sort of perk up. That's his thing, right? You need to find the people who jump when they hear your mission, the funders who really love your model. There's great research that says you don't actually need 10,000 donors. You need 1,000 raving fans. That's it. So if you think about it, I live in New York. There are millions of people here. When I was raising money, I had, at the time that I left my organization, fewer than 600 individual donors, and we were bringing in six figures in individual donations. I did not need 1 million donors. Not everyone's your audience. They don't need to be for you to be amazingly successful. So your key is to find your true ideal donors and funders and aim your energy there. Build a community for them. Which leads to the third thing, know where they are. Become really familiar with where your people congregate. Where do they meet? What do they read? What conferences do they go to? What podcasts do they listen to? What influencers do they follow? What other organizations are they partnering with? Be intentional about looking for indicators of what's called their affinity, how much they care about your mission, and track those indicators so that you can get in front of your ideal donors and funders more consistently and more easily. That's how you build an engine. That's how you build a model. Be in those places. And finally, you want to have clear and effective strategies for building relationships with potential donors and funders. Cultivation is king. Over time, the asks are going to get bigger. You're going to get better at it. But you will find that bringing in larger donations earlier in your startup phase grows directly in proportion to the effectiveness and depth of your cultivation. How much do people care? How relational is your fundraising? Don't get me wrong. Tactics are important. The campaigns, the events, they're powerful when they're done right. But when you focus on building relationships, cultivating, helping people to understand what you're doing, who you are, and why, getting them to give and getting them to give more becomes less about sort of convincing them and more about inviting them to invest. And so the sooner you do that, the stronger your sort of capital infrastructure will be. The upshot here is you don't want to just throw spaghetti against the wall, even when it feels like you just have to sort of keep moving. You want to carve out even just a little time to be deliberate and intentional about building a system for stable capital from the beginning. So the third element is capacity. And this is both your staff and your board. It's your network of people under your tent, meaning the people who are sort of in the battle with you, right? They're on the team with you, you should say. And I love this quote because it gets both at the fact that everything powerful requires collective action and collaboration, requires a team, and at the fact that the parts of the team must work in the right way together for the spark to turn into a fire. So capacity is about your team, getting the right people under the tent with you and doing the right things in service of your North Star, of that clarity that we talked about. So myths, what is capacity not? And these are really, really important to think about in the startup phase for an organization. Your capacity is not just a group of well-meaning volunteers who are willing to chip in and help. In the idea phase, absolutely. But you're going to need to move fairly quickly out of that phase. You're going to need to be intentional about who you bring under the tent. When you're ready to begin institution building, if you decide that that's the route you want to go in, you need to actually set criteria for who's under the tent. You need to be clear about the indicators of that criteria. You need to interview and select the right people, even if they are volunteers. So I am not at all saying not to use volunteers. They are a really powerful source of capacity. But I am saying to be intentional about saying yes to the right ones that fit the roles that your organization actually needs from day one, and finding other ways to engage the ones that are not the right fit. Conversely, this is also not necessarily full-time people with benefits, right? I think that's another source of stress for people, is the sense that, oh my God, I have to hire this full-time team. And oh my gosh, how are we going to give them health insurance? So you do not need to feel pressure really early to hire everyone within a traditional full-time employment model. For the first years of my organization, I had one full-time person and a bunch of sort of part-time, temporary summer folks and some independent contractors. We designed a fellowship in the third year of my organization, and that was a really fun way to partner with some universities to increase our staffing capacity in ways that also created a pipeline, sort of a leadership and professional development pipeline, which was important to me. And that's related to this third piece. So capacity is not just about filling a traditional organizational chart or board matrix, right? Your capacity is both your staff and your board. When we're starting, we look for models, and that's great. Why reinvent the wheel? But you don't have to sort of look at like, oh, this is what a traditional board looks like. It has these 6 committees and 3 people on each committee, and this is what an agenda looks like. And this is what a staff chart looks like. We have 4 directors and 3 managers and 2 associates in each line. You want to get away from that idea. Every organization, when you pull back the curtain or lift up the hood, whichever metaphor you want, has a very unique and tailored constellation of capacity that fits what they need. As you grow, if you need to deepen and expand your program work, then you flesh out your program team. If your program work is good, you got that model down, but you need infrastructure and finance, and you need people to send invoices, say, to partners, or somebody to work with your bookkeeper, then you flesh out your ops team. If partnerships are a huge part of what you're doing, then maybe you need an entire, person to be your strategic partnerships person. Each organization is going to be different. So you want to make sure that you find the right roles for your growth. So that leads to what we do want to focus on for capacity. Figure out the right roles. Figure out the roles that you need to be filled right from the beginning, the nature of the work that you need to have done, and then find the people for that. On the board, make sure that you have a board that's committed to the mission, not just you, and that wants to grow and learn and engage and contribute, that wants to be a board. And it can feel scary because you're like, well, we have to have people on the board. You do, and you want to grow your board, but you want to build the culture right from the beginning of having a board that's committed to the institution. On staff, it means thinking creatively about staff structure. I mentioned, this sort of combination of volunteers, interns, externs, fellows, part-time, temporary, VAs, virtual assistants, consultants. You want to think really creatively. Start with your roles and then fold in the infrastructure that fits those roles in a way that is calibrated to what you can afford. Like I said, most organizations, when you peel back the curtain, have a really nuanced structure made up of multiple types of staff. This is really important, this capacity piece. I mean, all 3 of the pieces are really important, but the capacity piece is important because you can't do this alone. And what happens if you bring the wrong people under the tent, get the wrong people on the team, is that even if you look around and you see a lot of people, you wind up doing too much of this alone. And so don't let the fear of not having the support you need push you into bringing people on that are really going to leave more on your plate than should be on your plate. You're going to spend time and resources coaxing and convincing board members to show up at meetings and to be thought partners and tweaking and shifting staff people from role to role. That's time you could be spending building your fundraising engine, developing institutional partnerships, etc. So we've talked about why each of these pieces is powerful on their own. These are the core drivers of a healthy organization: clarity of vision, the capital to fuel your vision, and the capacity to make it happen. But the key is this: combined, they are more than the sum of their parts. This is how you launch and grow a high impact organization from the beginning. They all go together. The power is in how they feed off of one another and intersect. How much more easily funding comes when you have a clear vision. How much more funding allows you to build your team. When they work together, you have a real organization, not just a messy constellation of programs, people, and small pots of money. So I want to highlight just a few of the things that I've seen with organizations that have certain pieces and not others. So when you have the clarity, say a strategic plan, and you have a great team, clear growth plan, incredible people, what will happen is you're not going to grow, right? You'll run in circles. You're going to bring in small, teeny pots of money, but you're not going to actually bring in the capital that you need to support your programs and grow over time. You're always going to feel like you're sort of hustling. When you have the clarity and the money, but not the team, and this could be no people or the wrong people, it means too much stays on your shoulders. You're going to burn through your funding again without growing because you don't have the capacity to aim at your programs. You don't have the board to actually bring in other resources. You're not going to be able to sustain whatever growth you make. And particularly in the early stages, this is important because part of what you need in your programming is proof of concept, right? Data that says, yep, this theory of change that I have works. And that's really hard to get without the capacity piece. And finally, let's say you have the money and the team, but no clarity. You're fuzzy on your concrete priorities or your annual goals, or you don't start collecting data to help you know what you're doing that's working, what's not, what to do next. You're going to struggle in these early years to make the right decisions about how to grow, about who to hire, about which type of board members you need, which types of partnerships are going to maximize your impact. Without that clarity, your team, your funders, the early supporters you have, they're going to get confused and you're going to run in circles. It's going to very often lead to disinvestment. People are sort of like, well, what are we doing? Where are we growing? And I think worst case scenario, you look up years down the line and it's just taken you a lot longer to get where you wanted to go. So this is all not just nice to have. It's a little bit like a stool with only two legs. If you are missing one of these core elements, then as the founder and the leader, you're going to feel overwhelmed. You're going to be weighed down by the weight of the work and slogging through trying to grow your funding and your team and your impact. You need all of the pieces in this framework to be targeted and in balance in order to grow. Here's another quote. It does not do to leave a live dragon out of your calculations if you live near one. So the key here is you really want to know the pieces and account for them. You don't want to leave any of the three elements out during your launch and your growth, just as you wouldn't want to leave a dragon out of your calculations. You want to be deliberate about including and thinking about each of these elements as you plan your launch and your growth. What needs your attention? What to do first? So let's make this real. How do we actually do this in your organization? And the reality is, it is doable. It's 100% doable. So I want to break it down into the building blocks that you want to think about and apply in this early startup phase. There are 10 core building blocks in what we call organizational design. These are the basic building blocks that we look to in order to grow and stabilize our clarity, our capital, and our capacity. At its core, organizational design is about making intentional choices to design your institution structure, culture, and processes from the beginning so that you position yourself for stability and growth in the early years. And if we think about the three areas of high impact organization that I've mentioned, clarity, capital, and capacity, just thinking about them on their own may feel overwhelming. The way that you apply them, think about which lever to pull, when, and in what order, is by notching down to the more fundamental elements, the building blocks. Anytime you want to make a decision about one of the elements in your organization, like Capital, your finances, your fundraising, or your capacity, your staff, hiring, growing your board. Look at the 10 elements and ask questions. I'm going to share some questions in a moment that help you determine which building blocks to manipulate in which way. These are some examples of some core questions. So I mentioned that you can email me any questions you have. I'm going to put together a little toolkit based on this webinar when we're done, and I'll email it to you. And I will include a more robust version of this framework in the follow-up to this webinar. But I wanted to give you a sense here of how you use these building blocks to apply the three-part framework. This is just to give you a sense of what these mean in practice and how to apply them in your early years. So these are examples of questions, core questions to guide growth that you'd want to ask for each of these boxes. And I'll highlight just a few. When you think about resources, you're asking yourself, how are we defining and allocating our time, our capital, our money, and our space? Are we doing it in a way that serves us? Are we doing it in a way that detracts from our ability to move forward? As you grow and you start having meetings with teams, are we effectively and efficiently using our time and coordinating our efforts? Right? How do we share information, which relates to workflow? How are we dividing and organizing the information that's coming into the information that's coming into the organization? This is really important when you think about your board, right? How are they getting the information that they need to be effective ambassadors out in the world? And this is a question from day one. Even if you only have 3 board members, how is information flowing? How is shared work flowing, particularly with board members who don't work for you, right? They're volunteers that work with you. So how do questions of authority, who gets to make decisions about what? It doesn't matter what part of your organization you're thinking about, capital, clarity, or capacity. These different building blocks are implicated when you ask questions that just get you thinking, how does this implicate the culture I'm trying to build? How do I need to think about staying innovative even as we further cement the core model that we have, right? What is the right balance between innovation and stability and standardization? So just a quick example, because it doesn't actually matter what questions you have and what constellation of sort of challenges or issues you're navigating. The 3-part framework and the building blocks are always the same. They work the same. So I just want to show you really quickly what it actually looks like when you are applying the building blocks to one of the elements of the framework. So let's say we're talking about building capacity, and very specifically, you want to build your staff chart, right? Who are the staff? Who are the people that I want to bring into my staff? So just an example of how 3 of the building blocks might be relevant. When you look at structure, you might ask yourself, how can I be creative about part-time and temporary staff? Right? What's a creative structure that will allow me to build my capacity to keep pace with the growth of our programs? You might also think, how can I use meetings as a way to make disconnected people feel like a real team? Right? So if in your staffing chart you have temporary workers, you have virtual assistants, you have interns, and you have board members, how can you use meetings as a way to make them feel like a team? Right? How can you pull that lever in a strategic way? Finally, you might ask about purpose and strategy. What are the right roles to support our purpose? How do we actually map the structure onto our strategic goals in the coming year, right? How do purpose and strategy and structure intersect? So you're building your capacity, you're thinking about building your staff, but in a way, but by asking these more discrete questions as you go. So like I said, it's always the same 3 elements and it's always the same process to apply them. Before we wrap up, I want to take a moment just to talk about mindset, and I want to leave time for questions. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention mindset gremlins, because they are real. And when I say mindset gremlins, I mean those fears and inner narratives that we all have that are a constant reminder of the vulnerability that we feel as we grow, right? Every single person who is thinking about or in the process of building an institution, every decision you make is an act of creation. And that means that you are putting yourself, your institution, your ideas out into the world in a way that, if you're growing, requires constant exposure. And for many people, that equates to vulnerability. It means that you're vulnerable as you grow to a staff that can disagree with your choices, a board that's actually your boss, funders, and this has happened to any of us who've been in this game for a while, that can take back their support if they don't like what you're doing. It can be really scary in ways that we're not even aware of. It's the backstory to our movies that isn't even on the screen. I heard this amazing presentation by Brene Brown, and she boiled this entire topic of vulnerability, which she talks about, down to this picture. She was talking about this space that so many of us are in, so many creatives, founders are in. And I knew at a gut level, as soon as I saw this picture, what she was talking about. It's the space that's just before we expose ourselves. We look up at the sunlight, we're planning, for me, it's procrastinating. We're talking with great excitement about how incredible our impact is going to be. We sort of inch into programming. We talk about what's coming. And the talking about what's coming and the planning is the safe space before we launch. We know those devils and challenges. And she made a point that I think is really important. We can't achieve the incredible impact that we dream of, that we talked about at the beginning of this training, if we stay in this space. So we have to reframe and rewrite we have to identify what they are, and then reframe some of the foundational beliefs that we have about growth if we're going to launch and build a sustainable organization. So I just wanted to highlight just a few of these mindset shifts that are really common in the early phases. I could never ask someone for a check for $10,000. So a mindset shift there is, I know that I'm going to build new relationships with people over the course of building this organization. And I'm going to find my people, the people who are excited about what I'm doing. And they will see donating as an investment in a shared vision. That's an invitation. A $10,000 invitation. That's a different ask. That's a different feeling. I don't know the right people to invite to the board to help us grow and deepen our impact. Again, a mindset shift. As I find my people, my network's going to grow, and it's going to yield excited, engaged, new thought partners that I haven't even met yet. Finally, this is a big one. If I make a wrong decision, I'll never get my organization off the ground. So here's the thing, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart. There is no misstep that you're going to make that will ruin your organization. And I have seen them all. When I started my organization, I failed to sign up for workers' comp. I had one person on staff. I saw the letter that said I had to do it. I was like, we're fine. I'll get around to it. There's so many other things I'm doing. And then I got a very strongly worded letter from the workers' comp folks that said that I owed something like $10,000 a day in back fines, and it was like $100,000. And my budget at the time was $70,000. So you can imagine, I was like, so I've ruined this organization. I'll give away the ending. I had not ruined the organization. We were totally fine. And if we can withstand that, there's almost nothing you're going to do that's going to be that wrong. So you have to move forward bravely and not be too worried about that. So let's recap. We talked about the 3 parts of a high impact organization: clarity, capital, capacity, and how they all go together as you're thinking about launching and stabilizing your organization in the early years. We talked about how the 10 building blocks of any healthy organization, of organizational design, can be used within the framework to help you really laser focus on which decisions to make first. And now you understand how all of this, or hopefully understand better, how all of this works together to help you build the staff, board clarity and funding engine that you need to launch and to grow. So the last thing I want to tell you about, and I said at the beginning that I tell you a little bit about how you can get started right away. I want to share this resource and opportunity. It is an amazing program. It's one of the projects that I work on. It's housed at it's an initiative of the Urban Justice Center here in New York City. So the Social Justice Accelerator is a 2-year cohort-based program that is designed explicitly to shepherd new and early stage social justice organizations through many of the challenges that I talked about, through the challenges of developing a well-functioning organization. Over 2 years, organizations that are invited to join, and it is by application, get free office space in New York, back-end support from the Urban Justice Center, mentorship, curated resources, curated training in areas of fundraising, finance, strategic communication, staffing, and board development, and advice from and access to a community of social entrepreneurs. The applications are due by December 1st, and you can actually go to the Urban Justice Center website. You can apply, it's pretty prominent there. But just to make it really simple, I created a little bit.ly SJA application. And that'll take you directly to the application PDF. If you have any questions, you can also email me. And like I said, in the coming days, I'm going to be reaching out to share some additional startup and launch resources via email. So I will also include the link to the application there. So any questions about all of this? There was a lot there. I wanted to make sure to get it in the hour. And I want to make sure that there are opportunities. You can pop them in the chat if you have any questions, and I can answer them. Okay, if there are no questions, then I will say thank you so much. Oh, I do have a question. Any advice about finding co-founders? Yes, that have skills and background that complement ours. Absolutely. So the best way to find a co-founder is if you're looking for a complement to skills, what you want to do is look in your current networks and think about potential co-founders the way that you would think about potential donors or investors. So if you think back to when I was talking about finding your people, and I'm happy to chat about this offline because I have some specific strategies around this. There is a set of strategies for identifying your sort of top supporters and investors called stages and pages. And this is a pretty systematic way of identifying where people who care very deeply about your issue, because that's going to be the key for a co-founder. It has to be somebody who really cares very deeply about the issue, where you're looking for a complement of skills and background, not affinity, right? They have to be right there in the trenches with you. So you want to start with people, places, and stages are conferences. They are other organizations. They are other institutions. And then pages are blogs, news media, etc. You want to get into those places and find the most active, most committed people in your affinity space. And then you pitch, right? And then you say, look, I have this idea. I will tell you, when I started my organization, I spent 6 months doing what I called a listening tour, and I think this absolutely is the kind of thing you would do to find co-founders. I identified these deep affinity-based spaces, and then I had informational sessions. I invited them to coffee if they didn't live in New York where I lived at the time and live now. Then I did it over the phone. And I said, here's this idea that I'm thinking about. What sounds great about it? What doesn't sound great about it? How would you implement it? And then as you hear them, a natural next question may be, do you want to be on the team. Do you want to do this with me? But you start in the affinity-based spaces, think stages and pages to help you figure out where those spaces are. And then you set up a structured way of narrowing in on people who have the deepest affinity and the most interest in partnering with you. Like I said, you can reach out. I'm going to put my email here, and I'm happy to talk through that in more detail. Do I have any advice about starting a tech-based foundation rather than a client-serving nonprofit? Yep, I work in nonprofits, so I have a good sense of what goes into that, but this feels like it could be a quite different process. So I guess one question is it a grant-giving foundation or a tech-based company would be my question, as opposed to a nonprofit. And the reason I ask is I talked a lot about programming in this, but a lot of the organizations that I work with aren't client serving. They are advocacy based. They offer programming in the sort of lowercase p sense that isn't necessarily even about direct service. My organization, for example, is not a direct service organization. So if you want to grant based, okay, so we should chat offline about that, because there are actually some of this is absolutely tied in terms of the capacity piece, how you think about staff and how you think about bringing in the network of support. But you're right, it is a very different process to set that up, and I'm happy to talk with you about that. How do you think about the clarity piece when theories of change may evolve in response to learnings? That is a really, really good question. Awesome, Prama, you can email me. Fantastic. So here's the thing about your theory of change. Your theory of change, so there's the problem that you have identified, which shouldn't change, right? That's the problem that leads you to want to start the organization. There's the who it's for, which shouldn't change. The piece that can be tricky is the what are we doing to solve the problem? So I have a two-part answer to that. The first is, in the early phases, you're exactly right. The theory of change, that last piece, is going to adjust as you learn. So you may not set your theory of change in month 6. It may be at the end of year 1, right? You do this, like I said, I did a listening session. I did a deep needs assessment, which I also have a training on, and I'm happy to share with you about that. So in the early months, that will change. But the second part of my answer is that last part of the theory of change that says, what are we doing in response to the problem? Isn't these are the programs we're running. It's these are the strategies that we've identified that we think are best suited. So let me tell you briefly about what the difference is. So a strategy that we might identify would be we are trying to address the issue of hunger. And so you might say that the programs or the activities are we run food pantries, right? But the strategy is we take leftover food from big institutions and redistribute it to people who need it. That's the bigger strategy that we are saying is going to help reduce hunger in these communities. And by staying at this level, it means that maybe right now, the way that we are redistributing this food from larger institutions is through food pantries. But in 2 years, as we learn more, then the way that we're redistributing the food from larger institutions is through birch boxes, or something like that, little boxes that are mailed to people's houses, or it's through partnerships with barbershops, because we know a lot of families go and get their hair done together, and so we're going to partner. The activities will change, but the theory about how you're moving resources and how you're allocating energy, that won't change. It may take you a few months, a year to cement it, and you want to be intentional about that. But you keep it up at the level of what's the core strategy we're using? Is it advocacy? Is it coalition-based work? Is it redistribution of resources? Is it strategic partnerships? That's the level that you're talking about in your theory of change. And so once you cement that, that doesn't change. I hope that helps. Any other questions? Awesome. I'm glad that was helpful. So what I will also do is I shared my email. I will also see what resources I can find that provide a little more insight into the questions you guys asked and pop those just in case some other of you are interested in those answers too. Pop those into this follow-up email that I'm going to send. Um, and with that, I will say thank you for being here. It was great spending the time with you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.